Hello, and welcome to another installment of our Wisdom Figures of Preaching, sponsored by our Preaching as Hospitality Formation program here at Immaculate Conception Seminary. I'm Father Dominic Siriaco, the director of the program. In this installment of our Wisdom Figure of Preaching, you will be introduced to Father Robert Stagg. Father Stagg is a priest of the Archdiocese of Newark for over 50 years. He has recently retired, and he served the Archdiocese of Newark well as priest, as a campus minister at Caldwell University, and as pastor of St. James in Springfield and Church of the Presentation in Upper Saddle River. In those two places, he actually helped to build new churches there. Father Bob Stagg is known for his preaching. He loves to preach. He's collected preaching books over the course of his time as a priest, and he's a great storyteller. He actually, you will hear in this video how he has kept all of his homilies from the time that he was ordained to the present moment. Pay particular close attention to how he is a hospitable preacher, how he welcomes and invites people into his homily. So with no further ado, let us turn our attention to Father Robert Stagg, a wisdom figure of preaching.
So, Father Stagg, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Good, Angelic. I'd be happy to. And I have to tell you, when Father Dominic called and asked me to get involved with this, and I put a pad together, and my normal practice of preparing things, and I threw that down about 2 weeks ago. I found this to be very enjoyable, kind of a lot of fun, reflecting on this, and so this whole exercise has been enjoyable for me, and I appreciate being here. So, where am I coming from? I'm actually 50 years ordained this year. And at the end of this month, I'll be 51 years ordained. I wish I could go back and do it all over again. I wish I was 35 and I could start. But I come out of Bergen County, Bergen Catholic High School. My parish was Our Lady of Mercy in Park Ridge, and we always had three priests and a pastor, four priests there. The weekend guys were Father Toro, and Father Ed Cuba, the two scripture professors at the seminary. They would come in as the weekend warriors. So I had the benefit of listening to great homilies, and Charlie Hudson was one of my heroes, one of the parish priests who's this dynamic guy. The other guy was Tom Kleisler, who started Renew International. So a lot of talent. Um, and I ended up at the seminary, which was, I loved the experience. At the end of the seminary, in those days, they sent a few students. They weren't sending people to Rome, but they sent a couple of us for a few years in a row to the Netherlands, to the University of Leiden. And Edward Skillebeeks, the great Catholic theologian, was a visiting fellow at Leiden, and I spent the summer with him there. I ended up doing a D-Min at Drew University, and I enjoyed that tremendously. And then one of my big influences was during my seminary time. All seminarians are given an apostolic assignment, and I'm sure that probably happens here today. And one of a young priest who was in charge of Bergen County CYO as one of his side hustles, and he had later taught here. His name was Kokora. He was a moral theologian. He had gotten myself and another young seminarian involved, and he asked us to kind of invent a a weekend retreat for high school kids, and we called it the Encounter Weekend. And we would end up taking a bunch of kids away Friday night to Sunday afternoon. We'd always train a team of a couple of seminarians, and I always hustled to find some post-college women who could run small groups. But it gave Bob Harahan and myself a tremendous amount of experience in speaking, in developing different styles. Later on, when I was first ordained, a Trappist came along named Vince Dwyer, who some of the older priests of the diocese would remember. He was involved with support groups, and he would do a 4-day retreat in a diocese, and then establish growth plans and establish a small Christian communities for priests to join. And when he left the diocese, one, I was on the team for the diocese. We were trained, but then he asked myself and a couple other priests from here, I think they're both deceased now, if we would join the international team. So they would parachute me into any of the English-speaking countries, Canada, the US, England, one point Australia, and they would gather the priests of the diocese, and we would give a retreat to them. So, and that ended up me doing a kind of a side hustle in my probably first 25 years of ministry. I did a lot of retreat work, mission work, days of recollection, high schools, colleges, parish staffs. So that helped me form my preaching career and my preaching background. Yeah. Do you remember your first homily? I do. So I'm a little nerdy. You know, I like to look very off the cuff, but I prepare very hard. And years ago, one of the priests, Frank McNulty, a legendary preacher in the diocese, who was on the faculty here at the seminary, and then he was a pastor. Wonderful guy. He died a couple of years ago. It might have been the best preacher we've ever turned out. But Frank had encouraged me to start a 3-year file on the 3-year Sunday Mass cycle and the liturgy. So I started 50 years ago, and I can tell you what homily I gave on, the first Sunday of Advent, in 1975, and I can date it. So I have this heavy filing cabinets system, but I also keep files on weddings, funerals, retreats files. So I'm very nerdy like that, but I can go back in. Unfortunately, it's not online. I started it long before the internet. Yeah. Good.
What do you use those files for? Like, do you ever go back and look at certain homilies or?
All the time. So I have as I begin homilies, one of my systems is I always read the next Sunday. This Sunday night, I would finish up my day, and that Sunday night or early Monday, I would read the gospel for the following Sunday in the first and second readings. And I have a preaching area of where I live. I've always had a preaching room or a preaching area, a preaching library, and I keep a pad out. And the coat rack that was in your parents' house when you opened the door, and all the coats and the hats and the umbrellas and all kinds of junk accrued to the coat rack. So my coat rack theory is that the pad and pencil, and I just all week long I'm generating ideas. When I'm at the ShopRite and I run into somebody, I'm at the town pool, I'm working out, I'm reading a book, I'm watching a TV show, and things are popping up all the time. Today, as I get older, it's usually 3 in the morning when I roll over and I get ideas, and I write them down next to my bed. But by the time I go to put my thoughts together, and I have a file of the last 50 years on that particular Sunday, but I've generated all these new ideas, and coming from the current week, and so it's a matter of editing, and then I'll take those ideas and I'll file those too. So if I come across it 3 years from now, I might say, what's going on here? But I find that incredibly helpful. Yeah.
I guess I have a question for you, and this is the question that I ask to everyone: is what do you think hospitable preaching is? What is that for you?
Yeah. One, being intensely aware of the people that you're preaching to. Uh, the privilege of being a priest is being invited into people's lives during moments of life and death, pain, joy, anxiety. Um, when I ring the doorbell, people don't ask why I'm there. We have an open sesame priest, and into their lives, uh, and also I've conducted a number of capital campaigns, and capital campaigns are when I've been able to build 2 new churches in my time, and when you run a capital campaign, it's going to bring out the pain in the parish. So if there's any pain when you're sitting in somebody's living room and say, "Can you donate 10,000?" They're going to say, "Well, you know what? You weren't there when my son was baptized, or why didn't you go to the cemetery after my mother's funeral?" Or if there's any pain related to you or to the parish or to the church in general, it's going to come out. And that pain, like those key moments in people's lives, staying in touch with it really brings me to the gospel themes and allows me to preach on that. Yeah, I find that very helpful. Yeah. There's a program that I've used Sunday to Sunday. I don't know whether you're familiar with it, but it was an alumni of the seminary, Michael Russo, who spent most of his ministry uh, out in San Rafael, California, at St. Mary's University. Mike retired a few years ago, and he had a number of grants, but he started a program called Sunday to Sunday, which was about preaching. And he had Father Sheeran, who was the president here at the university, was out working out in San Francisco at the time. Mike had 5 or 6 priests on the West Coast, Bob Sheeran being one of them. They would follow them around with a camera crew and follow them for about an hour's worth of programming, and then and film one of their homilies in situ on a Sunday morning. So then Mike came to the East Coast, and he invited about 3 or 4 of us on the East Coast to do the same thing. So he moved into my rectory with his film crew, and this was maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And you can Google Sunday to Sunday. I think it still runs in Long Island and in Canada, movie clips. And I was using it at the time for seminaries and to teach preaching and homiletics. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. And I think we talked about this one a little bit, but like, how do you write a hospitable homily? Like, what does that process look like to you?
Well, for me, it begins that Sunday night, and my prayer all week long, my reflection, any of my conversations, and anybody who steps into my life in any way, or literature. Um, uh, Case in point, uh, the second Sunday of Easter was the story of Emmaus this year. Theo of Golden is, on the bestseller list, right at the top of it these days. A fabulous read, but very much it's the story of Emmaus. Somebody then weren't our hearts burning while he was in our midst, and it's the story of this old man. I don't want to ruin it for you, but at the end, the author is very explicit about the Emmaus story. At the end, he references it to last weekend, where the Good Shepherd, 2 weekends ago, the fourth Sunday, Good Shepherd Sunday, I was following a woman in the op-ed pages of the New York Times, and Jodi Cantor, and she spoke at Columbia University's graduation last year. She and her partner broke the Harvey Weinstein story, and initiated the Me Too movement. So, but she tells her own story, and she writes today, in this baccalaureate season and graduation season, she talks about this is a difficult time to start a career. These 2 words can help, and her 2 words are craft and need. You got to work your craft. Um, and she said she was fired from her college newspaper, and she went to law school, hated it, dropped out, much to her parents' chagrin. They were paying for it, and but she said she was passionate about journalism, and she said most people come out of college and they go into survival mode. How am I going to earn enough money to get an apartment in Hoboken? And they choose to do things that you're not passionate about. And she said after a while, she followed her passion. She got her nose broken a few times, but she said, you don't know your craft at 21. Hopefully you might know a good sense of it at 35, but you got to work your craft. And I was just thinking of that Good Shepherd homily that day. At the end of it, Jesus says, and I'm the gate, and I'm the Good Shepherd, and I've come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. Well, she would say, work your craft, and that actually gives you authority in your field. And then the other piece of it is need. What does society need? What does the community need? And that's your propulsion. So if you're a fireman, You gain experience, you take courses, you work your craft. Your community desperately needs your gifts. Um, in her case, she's been one of our best journalists in our country. But you would say the same thing about a preacher. You've got to work your craft hard. You've got to read and you got to listen, and you got to be passionate and take courses and travel and love and not love, and you know you need a lot of experience to step up in that pulpit. I mean, when the guys get out of the seminary here, they get a really good background, but they're beginning their craft, and they got to work it hard to develop that so that they have something to say.
How do you think your preaching has changed when you first started to present day?
Yeah, I can run through a bunch of things, do's and don'ts that I look at now,
Okay.
best practices. If you don't mind, I go back now and I look at my files that I talked to you about, and I see some of my first 5 years of homilies, and I say, it could have been better. I could have been onboarding. Yeah, how do you help people get on board? How do you help them hear? That's on us. Um, you've got 30 seconds to begin a homily. If you don't connect on those first 30 seconds, they're doing the list of shopping at the ShopRite later on that day, or they're running through the week's needs. They're gone. So you've got 30 seconds, and if you start, well, today's first reading seems to me, they're gone. They're gone. And how do you help them on board? I like to at the beginning of the mass, I usually say that this is where we're going to be today. The Acts of the Apostles are talking about who should the new guys be coming into the church, and the gospel is going to highlight this. And if I don't do it then, now I'm a guest because I'm retired and I'm a guest in all the parishes where I preach. But when I was a pastor, often I would go down before mass began. I have an Albon, and I would say, this is the first reading is going to be about this. The second reading is this. The third reading is this gospel. So I would prepare them to hear, when I would get up there. No slow starts. How do you end? Just stop. Just stop, because there'll be preaching is a jealous mistress. There'll be another day tomorrow, another day the next day, another day next Sunday. You can't do all of salvation history and systemic theology in the pulpit today. I'm a big person. I believe in like 6 or 7 minutes. Last Sunday, I didn't have a liturgy, and I dropped into the parish, and this guy gave a terrific homily for about 7 minutes. Unfortunately, he went 15 minutes. He had about 7 different endings. And I'm saying, land that plane, get it in the hangar. If he did that, I think it would have been a superb. But he said it over and over and over. And we got it. We got the points to down. The delivery, I think, we talk about, the steak and the sizzle, and the steak being the material and the sizzle being how are you going to deliver it. If you can help people hear the homily. I'm a walker. I like to get out of the pulpit. I like to cut the distance down between myself and the congregation. If you've ever seen one of my nightmares is when a bride would ask me if all brides have a right to get married in their home parish and in the cathedral parish. And when I go down to Sacred Heart Cathedral, and Cardinal Tobin, if you're watching this, I apologize, but what a nightmare to preach at the cathedral. I mean, you sit here, and the altar's here, and about 50 yards away the bride and groom, and another 50 yards away are the congregation. So I mean, you're toast. And I understand when there's 3,000 people in church, but if you're at a wedding with 200 people, you got to cut that space down. I usually like to preach from the middle aisle, the top of the middle aisle, and walk around and to cut that space down if I can do it at all. I think it's very helpful to, I always have notes, and then I leave them in my office. I kind of learn where I'm going, and then you got to be prepared. But but you got to know where you're going. A light mist in the pulpit, heavy fog in the pew. If you don't know where you're going, your congregation isn't going to know. So you need to know your points. Keep a lot of arrows in your quiver. You got to have a lot of different styles of preaching. One of my favorite styles is eavesdropping. So if you can isolate a congregation, so if this is at a wedding, I'll go up and I'll stand in front of the bride and groom, and so I kind of give everybody permission to go to sleep while I talk to the bride and groom. And the opposite happens, because at that point, well, we don't have to listen to this homily. The people are so relaxed that they're listening like they've never listened before. You know, if you got a first communion group and you're preaching to the little kids, the grandparents and the parents are all over it, listening to it. Same thing with a funeral. If you can, talk to the family itself and let everybody else eavesdrop, I think, a terrific way of preaching. Teaching style of preaching, is another arrow I think is important. So I'll take some of the longer gospels. The woman at the well. I'll tell the people as I begin the gospel reading, I'll say, please sit down for the reading of the gospel, and I'll read a paragraph, and then I'll give a little sermonette, like maybe 2 minutes. Then I'll read a paragraph of the gospel and do another sermonette, and I'll read, preach, read, preach, repeat. I'll do that 5 or 6 times. It's a cheap ploy on my part to give 7 different homilies, but they're engaged. If you want to make a bunch of different points and try to do it well, I think that type of approach is good. I usually get a fair amount of feedback when I do one of those teaching homilies. Sometimes I preach on the mass parts. Particularly if I'm not moved particularly by the gospel or the readings that week, I might talk about why the priest drops the host in the chalice right before communion. What's that about? I'm an architecture person, so I've been able to build 2 churches, and I would talk about why we do what we do. Why do we want a crescent church? So we can look over at each other, and as opposed to the Gothic church where you're in the 29th row. In the crescent, you're staring over the altar and you see other people. So the body of Christ is on the altar, but the body of Christ is here listening. Stained glass windows. I often preach on stained glass windows, and they teach us. They taught the people in the Middle Ages, but you can use any, if there's an object, a toy, if something you can drag, the ambry. Why do we have an ambry? What do the oils mean here? I think that's important. The genealogies. We get to Christmas time, and we have that long list of, who begot who begot who begot who. We've got the list of, 44 different people. People go, you glassy eyed, but you can use the genealogy. There's so many good stories in the genealogy to go take a deep dive into the particular people and the characters. The 4 women in Matthew's genealogy. That's a homily dying to get out. And people will listen hard to that. You can tell their stories, which are fun stories. It's like gossiping, and what's the point to be had? St. Paul, I have to confess, the second reading of the Sunday cycle, for years I would avoid it like the plague and only use it once in a while to quote Paul. But one of the things I've gotten involved with over the years is taking people to the Holy Land. So I've taken 5 or 6 groups to the Holy Land, and you'll never hear scriptures the same way again. But the company that I use has encouraged me to do journeys in the footsteps of St. Paul. It's a popular way to visit Greece, Corinth, Thessalonica, Ephesus, and Turkey. And I've done that a few times. But in order to prepare for that, the first time I did it, I think I read 7 or 8 books about St. Paul. And although I had Pauline literature in the seminary, I kind of put that on the back burner for about 30 years. It's only in the last 20 years that I've really become a huge devotee of St. Paul, and kind of as the second founder of Christianity, and what he means to us and his themes. And so lately the last 20 years, I've been on fire about St. Paul's writings, and I preached on them many more times than I did when I was a young priest.
You talked about your different preaching styles and the way that you bring like different literature into your homilies, which I find really interesting. But I was wondering, and your filing system too, which I think is really interesting. But did you learn this from somebody else, or like, did someone or a group of people inspire you to do certain things, or did you just start doing it because of a habit, or?
So Frank McNulty had encouraged me to do the filing cabinet. I've have a hobby of finding good preachers, and I've had great models over the years. I have a preaching library. I think I have all of Walter Burkhart's books. He was the Jesuit who preached at Dowgrin Chapel at Georgetown, and I must have 15 of Burkhart's books. And he begins every homily. He said, "I've got 3 points," and he makes his 3 points different style. Bill Bausch, the trend priest, he's still alive. He's got a bunch of books out. If you haven't read Bausch's books or homilies, run to the nearest bookstore. Get on Amazon this afternoon. Bausch is worth the price of admission. He really knows how to give a homily. Um, Joseph Donders. John Donders is a Dutchman, a Dutch priest. He was a white father, and he spent most of his career working in Africa. I think I have all of his books. He's deceased now, but he had a very interesting kind of stream of consciousness approach to homilies. Uh, um, couple of Protestant guys I would highly recommend. Frederick Buechner, Buechner. He's he's a Protestant minister, and I forget what denomination, but he lived on a hill in New Hampshire, and he has written books, The Whistling Dark, the Surprised by the Spirit, Whistling Dark, Theological ABCs, The Hungering Dark. He's got a bunch of books out. His style is fabulous, and I've taken pieces. He's got a dictionary where he'll talk about figures in the Bible or theological pieces, and they're great starting points for homilies. Other Protestant preachers, there's a guy who was a true Charles Rice, and Ed Steinley over at Union Theological, and our own diocese. Actually, if you listen to Cardinal Tobin, he always has something to say. I've heard him say a few things a couple of times the same way, but every time he gets up to a microphone, he has something to say. He delivers it well. Um, you know, Cardinal McCarrick was here, and he obviously ended life on the wrong side, but McCarrick, when he got up into pulpit, and if he was coming to your parish, he would melt. He'd ooze out of the pulpit. He would touch every nerve in the congregation. He's a good preacher. There's a Salesian guy who was at Don Bosco Prep. He used to work on my staff at presentation on the weekends. Jim User. He's now at Salesian Prep in New Rochelle. He's one of the best active preachers I've ever heard. I used to sneak into the back of his homilies whenever he was preaching for me. So I think there's lessons to be learned, and to go. I don't think we hear other guys preach too often. I think that's something we should do.
What is your relationship with parishioners and hospitality? What kind of feedback do you receive?
A couple of thoughts on that. Obviously, I'm retired now, so I actually, because I am retired and I'm at new places, I'm probably getting more feedback today. As I preached in Montclair on Sunday, first time I ever preached there, but a lot of people came up to me and enjoyed the homily. Uh, where I help at the shore, and I'm sporadic there, like uh, maybe twice a month. And the other day I walked into a pub, like at noontime. We were watching some big game, it was a hockey game or something. I was with a couple of friends, and there had to be 10 guys there, and they all had to be 45, 50. And they said, "Hey, we missed you today at the beach chapel where I preach on occasion." And they said, "We've really been enjoying your homilies." And they all had a beer in their hand, and they all had to sit there and comment. And I'm new of the flavor of the month, uh, but I think that's important, that you have to connect. Right now, I get calls from my old secretary and people. They usually defend me pretty well, or kind of many people say, can Father Bob come up and do a funeral? Well, it's 75 miles up the Parkway. And I'll come up for some of the people. I don't come, I couldn't come up, every day. But a couple of weeks ago, I had a couple that had called me up. It's a young couple, and their daughter is about 10, and she leads our little kids choir, and she's a cantor, and she's excellent, and has the guts of a cat burglar. This kid, and she's good at what she does. Anyway, grandma dies, and grandma's in assisted living, and they were going to bury grandma at the parish where they all grew up in. It's not one of our parishes, and it remained nameless, but they had gone there, and they asked the pastor. They accepted the funeral, and they said, we'd like to have my daughter cantor a few songs. He said, no, she can't. And they said, we have some people we'd like to read. He said, no, we have professional cantors, professional readers, and we'll pick the readings, and we have professional readers who will read them. And they had some songs they wanted, like "Be Not Afraid," not a big stretch, one of our common songs, a good song. But he said, no, that's kind of pedestrian. We don't use that for funerals. We'll do something else. And so they were very, very upset. This is their mother. And they had called me to see if I could consider coming up to this parish. And, after talking to them they're a nice young couple. I'd see them every week. They come by you. And it's hard to, you got to be made of stone not to hear that. So I said I would come up and do the funeral. And then I said, you know what, why don't you just go to presentation? My old secretary, the bereavement coordinator, I said, call Melanie. I said, there's nothing that you're asking for is outrageous. I mean, if we want to be hospitable in moments like weddings and funerals, and this is where you connect with people. And these are people who are stalwarts. They're there all the time. And they ended up flipping the funeral to presentation. I ended up coming up to do it. And their daughter was a cantor. They had Be Not Afraid. They picked the readings and they picked the readers. And I think none of them are big asks. If we're trying to be hospitable and welcome people into church, I think there's things we can do. There's some on-ramps to help them get on. Same thing with weddings today. Every bride has a different idea of how to do a wedding. And today, I'm sure many of my brother priests are doing weddings on a Friday night, marrying them in the church and in the state, and on Saturday afternoon being asked could they show up at this venue and repeat the vows, maybe a short version of it, again in front of 250 people. So what it meant, it almost seems to me that a little bit like you're doing the real wedding is at the rehearsal, with the immediate families, and the next day. But should priests say no to that? I don't believe so. I think that's part of our hospitality. I think that we're being called in different ways. I spoke this past weekend about it was the ordination of the deacons. The deacons in the Acts of the Apostles. Should the apostles be bussing tables or out preaching? And they ordained these 7 men at really the beginning of the diaconate. But I spoke about a vocation crisis, and we hear people say, "What is a vocation crisis?" Well, I don't. Has the Holy Spirit stopped calling, stopped talking to us? I don't believe that. I think the Holy Spirit's calling you and you and you, and you know, 25 years ago, you wouldn't have been working at the seminary, probably either one of you. 50 years ago, you really wouldn't have been working at the seminary, but you're here today. So that's part of your vocation and your ministry. And I think as long as people do all that they can do, we'll be in pretty good shape. Could we use more sacramental ministers? Sure could. But the case in point, my previous staff that I just left had 25 people on it. Only 2 of them were ordained. And the other 23 who were very, very good at their craft, and terrific at the ministries and the charisms that they had. They made the community come alive because of what they do. I think, to your point, the feedback from the parishioners, that you have to have a sense of theology. That's knowing where you're going. you know, light mist in the pulpit, heavy fog in the pews. You gotta know what you're doing, and know where you're going, and a sense of theology, a sense of drama. You know, you can't give the people the same thing you did for the last 29 and a half years. You know, we, you can shake it up. You can do different things. We can think out of the box. Um, I think we need to be fresh and innovative and creative, and that's why being experienced to all of life. I see a play, go to a movie, have a conversation, go to dinner, know who Britney Spears is. You know, you probably have to, you know, you have to know a few of the current what Kendrick Lamar saying these days. Pay a little bit of attention. You may want to see Devil Wears Prada too, just to hear the lingo and the idiom. And if you don't, you're not going to be a good preacher unless you're enmeshed in the culture and you have a sense of who it is. So a sense of drama, a sense of theology, um, uh, a sense of God just being present here and transcended. And
What three lessons of prayerful preparation and or hospitality might you have for those preparing for ordination or those preparing to give retreats, days of recollection, and spiritual presentations?
Yeah, I would go back to the onboarding experience, how to help people listen. Um, get them ready for the homily with your opening remarks or a couple of statements before Mass begins. Um, I think you have to read the gospel well. And right now, I've had deacons where I'm helping out on at the shore. I like to read the gospel, and I like to present it, and I don't get to do that where I am on weekend. But that's part of the office, and it's a small thing. But um, I would be careful of the length of your homilies. You know, land that plane. Most people would rather feed their firstborn to an alligator than listen to one of your homilies. So prepare, prepare, prepare. Um, it's your craft. Jody Cantor's op-ed piece in the Times. I'd go back and take a look at that. This is your craft. Work it really hard. Um, 95% of your parish you're going to see on that 1 hour on Sunday morning. And the rest is the rest and your good moments. But that 1 hour is critical. It's absolutely critical that you have something to say, a sense of theology, a sense of drama, a sense of awe, a sense of God, a sense of humor. I think those things are really important. Yeah.